In the early morning, I had already discovered that 6 smiling executives had managed to turn a quarterly budget into a bonfire. I worked in financial management for Crisp Basket Group, a giant fast food franchise empire built on burgers, fried chicken, and the kind of cheerful branding that made investors feel safe. My job was less cheerful. I watched numbers for a living, which meant I spent my days translating glitter into math and math into trouble. That week, trouble came wrapped in store expansion reports from 6 regional executives who oversaw clusters of franchised locations. Their budgets were already generous. Their actual spending looked like a rich uncle had wandered into a casino with corporate cards and no adult supervision. On average, each one had gone more than $6 million over quarterly budget. Not 6,000, not 60,000, 6 million. I checked the reports again because disbelief deserves a second look. Then I checked vendor codes, transfer records, consulting invoices, lease amendments, and reimbursement ledgers. The overages were real. Worse, they were dressed up in pretty labels such as market acceleration, emergency remodel alignment, and customer experience uplift. A wasteful line item with a polished title is still a wasteful line item. Lipstick does not convert a pig into a policy. I called a meeting with the executives. I was not dramatic about it. I attached the variance summaries, flagged the approval thresholds, and included the section of internal policy that required board notice when material budget deviations lacked documented justification. I even highlighted the relevant part, which felt generous. They arrived with expensive watches, shiny teeth, and the relaxed confidence of people who believed a spreadsheet could be bullied. I stood at the screen and walked them through the numbers. Each of you exceeded budget authority. Collectively, the overrun is substantial. These expenses require documented business purpose, approval support, and escalation. Boyd, who managed Western stores and wore arrogance like a tailored jacket, leaned back and laughed. Rena, you are counting ketchup packets while we are building growth. That is interesting, I said, because your growth includes private dining charges billed as training support. A few of them chuckled. Mila, all diamonds and false patience, tapped her pen against the table. You are penny pinching, we move fast. That is how expansion works. Expansion works best when it is not indistinguishable from financial leakage, I said. That landed harder than I expected. A few faces tightened. Boyd smiled the way men do when they are deciding whether to insult you directly or package it as mentorship. You are young, he said. Learn the difference between cost and investment. I clicked to the next slide, where the so-called investment included duplicate vendor invoices, rushed remodel contracts awarded without bid review, and travel expenses with resort charges attached to store visits that somehow lasted several days. I know the difference. That is why I am still speaking. The meeting ended with laughter, eye rolls, and one executive asking whether I planned to confiscate their staplers next. I had expected resistance. And I had not expected them to be careless enough to mock written controls in a room with minutes being recorded. By later that day, they had run to the CEO. His name was Damon Voss, and he had the polished ease of a man who believed charm qualified as strategy. He summoned me to his office, where the windows were tall, the furniture was dark, and the atmosphere suggested that accountability had not been invited. He did not ask for the data. He did not ask whether my concerns were documented. He did not even pretend curiosity. He folded his hands and said, "Stop harassing my operators. They are driving revenue." "They are driving spending without authority," I said. He gave me a look usually reserved for gum under dress shoes. "Buzz off, Rena. You are not here to police executives." I almost smiled. Nothing sharpens a woman like hearing a weak man misuse power with full confidence. He thought he had reminded me of my role. He had. And my role, according to company procedure, was not to flatter executives while they set money on fire. My role was to document material control failures, preserve the evidence, and report the matter to the board of directors and the owner when executive management refused corrective action. Around lunchtime, HR sent me a calendar invite titled Role Clarity Discussion. I accepted. I also opened the governance manual. That was when the real meeting began. The HR meeting was scheduled with the kind of false politeness that always makes me check whether legal has already been copied. When I walked in, Kay from HR sat at one end of the table with a folder placed neatly in front of her. Damon sat beside her, serene as a crocodile in shallow water. He had the expression of a man expecting a tidy surrender. Kay smiled. This is simply to help you understand your role within the organization. I nearly thanked her for the reminder. Instead, I folded my hands and said, "Wonderful." I brought the policy manual. Damon looked annoyed before I even opened it. That was encouraging. Kay began in the soft, professional tone HR uses when it wants to sound supportive while building a record. Rena, your function is to support operational leadership, not obstruct it. I slid a printed copy of the financial controls policy across the table. Relevant sections were tabbed. I am not naturally theatrical, but tabs can make saints feel dangerous. My function includes identifying material variances, documenting unsupported expenditures, and escalating when executive management declines remediation. Damon did not even glance at the document. That is your interpretation. It is page 42, I said. My interpretation is less imaginative than yours. Kay cleared her throat. There may be a more collaborative way to handle concerns. There it was. Whenever people say collaborative during a compliance problem, what they usually mean is quiet. I kept my voice even. A collaborative way would have been for the executives to provide support for more than $6 million in average quarterly overruns. Since they laughed instead, I am following procedure. Damon leaned forward. You are creating unnecessary risk. That nearly made me laugh. No. I found it. The room went still. I had spent the early morning building a record, not a dramatic record, a useful one. I exported variance reports, preserved approval logs, downloaded invoice trails, and saved internal messages that showed repeated warnings had been brushed aside. I kept notes on who said what, when, and in response to which document. People think protection starts with outrage. It does not. It starts with records, dates, policies, clean facts. Emotion is satisfying. Evidence is employable. Kay gave me a careful look. What outcome are you seeking here? Correction, accountability, and compliance with reporting obligations. Damon exhaled through his nose. This is why finance people should not pretend they run the business. I stood. Not abruptly. Just enough to signal that the lesson period had ended. Finance does not need to pretend. Numbers run out of patience faster than people do. Then I gathered my papers and left before they could turn the meeting into a theater review of my attitude. Back at my desk, I followed the governance map exactly as written. I prepared a formal memorandum to the board, addressed to the audit committee chair, and copied to corporate counsel through the reporting channel specified for unresolved executive control failures. The memo was precise. I described the spending overages, the policy breaches, the lack of supporting approvals, the dismissive response from operating executives, the CEO's refusal to act, and the attempted HR intervention after my escalation request. Then, I wrote a separate formal email to the owner of the company, Sylvie Rohn. While as required by the same procedure when executive misconduct could expose the organization to material financial harm or reputational damage. I kept the language plain. Plain language terrifies dishonest people because it leaves them nowhere to hide. I did not speculate. I did not accuse anyone of crimes. I attached source documents, listed open questions, and requested independent review. That is another lesson nobody teaches young women quickly enough. Never make a louder claim than your evidence can carry. Let the facts do the humiliating. By sometime in the afternoon, both messages had been sent. Red receipts appeared one after another like small green fireworks. Then something surprising happened. Silence. No more smug messages from Boyd. No note from Kay about collaboration. No summons from Damon. The building felt too quiet, as if every hallway had paused to listen. Later that evening, a black sedan rolled into the executive parking area. A second one followed. Board counsel had arrived in person. I shut down my computer, slipped my notes into my bag, and smiled to myself all the way to the elevator. Nothing rattles a fragile empire like a woman who reads the manual they hoped nobody else would open. By the next early morning, the office had changed its perfume from confidence to panic. Nobody announced the board review, but panic has a distinct posture. Assistants whispered near conference rooms, senior managers walked too quickly while pretending they were not rushing. Damon kept his office door closed, which was new. Men like him usually leave the door open when they want witnesses for their authority. At some point before lunch, I received a message from board counsel requesting a meeting. Not with HR, not with Damon. With them. I entered a smaller conference room where 3 people waited. The audit committee chair, a silver-haired woman named June Bell, outside counsel, neat and expressionless, and a forensic accountant who looked like he had been born skeptical. It was the most comforting trio I had seen in weeks. June gestured for me to sit. We reviewed your memorandum. We need chronology, supporting detail, and your assessment of control breakdowns. At last, adults. I walked them through everything. Budget authority limits, approval thresholds, variance patterns, vendor anomalies. The executives who laughed. Damon telling me to buzz off. HR scheduling a meeting to help me understand my role. June took notes with the calm focus of a woman who had seen weak men perform this opera before. The forensic accountant asked, "Why did you believe escalation beyond management was necessary?" "Because management was implicated," I said. "Once the person responsible for correction refuses to act, ordinary reporting lines become decoration." He nodded once. Approval from that man felt like being knighted by a calculator. By later that day, board counsel had seized expense records, contract files, and communication archives for the relevant regions. They also froze discretionary spending authority for the 6 executives pending review. Watching that happen was deeply satisfying in the way ironing a wrinkled shirt is satisfying. Order returning to a surface that had been insulted. Then came the delicious part. One of the largest overages involved remodel contracts awarded to a vendor called Bright Nest Facilities. The name sounded cheerful. Their billing did not. Duplicate charges, change orders with thin support, consulting fees layered on top of construction invoices, and payment timing that conveniently skipped ordinary review. When the forensic team pulled corporate records, Bright Nest turned out to be partly owned through an intermediate entity tied to Boyd Cousin. Not Boyd personally, of course. Men like Boyd never hold the smoking match. They hire somebody else to smell like fire. Another executive had routed marketing funds into event packages that included luxury suites, guest hospitality, and vendor entertaining that had very little to do with fried chicken and everything to do with ego. Mila had called it strategic relationship development. I called it expensive flirting with the company wallet. June asked me one more question before the meeting ended. "Did anyone instruct you not to escalate?" "Not in writing," I said. That made her smile, just faintly. Women in power often smile that way when a fool has handed them a clean path. The story might have ended there if Damon had possessed even a teaspoon of humility. Instead, he tried to rescue himself by sacrificing me. Around sometime in the afternoon, I learned he had circulated a narrative that I was overreaching, unstable under pressure, and possibly retaliatory because leadership had corrected my communication style. There is something almost antique about a man trying to label a competent woman emotional while he sweats through his collar. Board counsel requested that slander in writing, too. Damon obliged. I did not have to defend myself. I simply supplied performance reviews, prior commendations, and records showing I had raised concerns through proper channels before speaking to the board. Paperwork is the polite cousin of revenge. It does not shout. It stamps. By evening, the board had enough to expand the investigation from budget overages to governance failure. That is the moment the matter stopped being about waste and became a question of fiduciary duty, oversight, and whether senior leadership had tolerated self-serving behavior. I went home, tired, hungry, and oddly cheerful. People like Damon always assume power belongs to the loudest person in the room. They forget that real power often belongs to the woman holding the receipt. The collapse began quietly, which is how serious collapses usually begin. Around the next morning, access changed. Boyd badge inactive, Mila calendar wiped. Two other executives placed on administrative leave. Procurement authority temporarily centralized. Emergency board session on the calendar. Outside communications routed through council. The company had gone from fast food giant to crime scene with branded napkins. Damon still came in, though. That told me he was either optimistic or delusional. In corporate settings, the difference is mostly footwear. I spent the day assisting the review team, not because I needed vindication, but because clean investigations need disciplined witnesses. I answered only what was asked. I did not embellish. I did not gossip. A woman protecting herself should remember that credibility is a savings account. Deposit carefully. Do not make flashy withdrawals. By sometime in the afternoon, June asked me to join a special session with Sylvie Rohn, the owner. Sylvie was not what I expected. No theatrical wealth, no glittering monologue. She wore a plain, dark suit and the expression of someone who had built an empire by assuming every smiling executive might someday need cross-examination. I liked her instantly. She thanked me for following procedure. Then she asked, "Why did you keep going after the CEO dismissed you?" I considered that. Because rules are useless if they only apply downward. And because once people with authority mock controls, they usually graduate from overspending to hiding. Sylvie leaned back and gave a short, approving nod. Exactly. Then June summarized the findings. Material budget overruns, conflicted vendor relationships, inadequate review of discretionary spending, retaliatory handling by management after internal reporting. Evidence that Damon had discouraged escalation and minimized control breaches to shield favored operators. Sylvie did not raise her voice. She did not need to. That is not leadership. That is a private club feeding on corporate funds. I almost framed the sentence in my mind. By later that day, Damon was placed on leave pending termination negotiations. The 6 executives were removed from operational control. Council prepared clawback analysis tied to bonus compensation. Procurement contracts were suspended for rebid. Insurance carriers were notified. A hotline notice went company-wide, reminding employees of protected reporting rights and anti-retaliation obligations. That memo was a thing of beauty. Then came my favorite twist. Kay from HR requested a meeting. This time, there was no folder and no soft smile. She looked like a woman who had discovered that standing too close to a fire does not make you management, it makes you flammable. She said she wanted to clarify that HR had only intended to support alignment. I let that sit in the air long enough to feel the silliness of it. Alignment with what? Exactly. She looked down. Leadership expectations. There is a useful phrase for that, I said. Retaliation risk. She swallowed hard. I was not cruel. I did not need to be. Reality was already doing excellent work. HR protects the company best when it respects procedure, not personalities. That landed. I could see it. By evening, word had spread through the building. Not the full details, just the outline. Executives gone. CEO finished. Board involved. Finance woman did not disappear. People looked at me differently in the hallway. Not warmly, exactly. More like they had realized the decorative vase in the corner was actually a loaded crossbow. I will admit something petty. I enjoyed that. Still, my real satisfaction came from something else. Women are often taught to survive institutions by becoming agreeable enough to avoid impact. But systems do not improve because someone smiles through misconduct. They improve because somebody knows where the policy lives, preserves evidence, and uses the correct door when the main entrance is blocked by cowards. That evening, June stopped by my desk before leaving. Board meets tomorrow. Be available. For what? Her mouth curved. For the part where competence becomes inconveniently visible. I shut my laptop and laughed. At last, my role was being understood. In the early morning, the board had finished what the executives thought nobody would dare start. Damon was out. Not gracefully, not with a golden speech about transition and gratitude. He was simply gone, escorted by the same legal machinery he had hoped to use against me. Boyd and the others were terminated for cause or resigned under arrangements that preserved the company right to pursue recovery. Bright Nest contracts were voided pending litigation review. Internal controls were tightened, approval bans revised, and regional spending now required dual certification from operations and finance for anything remotely resembling a vanity project in a suit. I was asked to attend the board session for closing recommendations. June introduced me without ornament. Rena Shaw identified the variance pattern, documented the escalation failure, and followed procedure when management attempted suppression. I kept my face neutral, though inwardly I wanted to send flowers to every spreadsheet I had ever loved. Sylvie addressed the room. This company grew because we respected discipline. Somewhere along the way, too many people confused scale with permission. That ends now. Then she turned to me. What would you change, besides people? That question mattered more than praise, because it meant the real work was beginning. I recommended mandatory conflict disclosures tied to vendor onboarding, quarterly board-level reporting on budget exceptions above material thresholds, independent review of remodel and marketing spend, and written anti-retaliation triggers whenever HR is involved, after protected internal reporting. I also suggested training for store and regional leaders on fiduciary duty, contract review basics, and why no one should sign a charming invoice with a blurry scope of work. A few board members smiled. June openly did. Sylvie asked one final question. Would you be willing to build this? I looked around the room that had nearly swallowed me whole. Yes, but I would build it with authority, not decorative responsibility. Sylvie laughed. Good answer. By later that day, I was appointed interim head of financial controls and governance reporting, with direct access to the audit committee until a broader restructuring was complete. My raise was substantial. My office remained modest. I kept it that way on purpose. Fancy furniture can wait. Clean systems cannot. Kay sent a short note congratulating me. I replied with professional grace and exactly zero emotional labor. As for Damon, I heard through the discreet grapevine that he told people I had ruined his career. That was generous of him. His career had rotted from the inside. I had simply turned on the lights. The strangest part was how calm I felt once it was over. Not triumphant in a dramatic, movie-ending way. Just settled. Like a lock clicking into place. Women in corporate life are often urged to be patient, pleasant, and politically aware. Fine. Be all three. But also be specific. Know the approval limits. Read the governance manual. Save the records. Separate facts from fury. If someone tells you to understand your role, understand it so well that the board learns your name from a flawless memorandum. Around dusk, I stood by my office window and looked out over a city full of buildings where someone, somewhere, was currently underestimating a woman with a sharp mind and a working printer. I smiled. At Crisp Basket, they had laughed when I warned them about millions bleeding out of the business. They called me petty. They called me difficult. They told me to buzz off. So I did. Straight past them, and all the way to the boardroom.